All right. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Allentza Michel, and I am the founder and principal of Powerful Pathways. I'm an urban planner, an artist, a community organizer, and I am a resident of this community. I grew up in Mattapan and Dorchester. I spent many years working deeply in Roxbury, and I currently live on Morton Street and Blue Hill Avenue, where I've been living for the past 12 years. So this work is very deeply important to me. Before I begin my presentation, I want to share a quick disclaimer, which is that what I'm about to present to you is a brief historic overview. It's not going to be a complete history. We don't have enough time for that. But I wanted to make sure that we covered the gamut around what got us to this moment today. So I'm going to ask folks to hold your questions. We will have time later on to discuss it. We have dedicated time in the agenda to discuss what's being presented, but it's a little hard to focus when things get popped up in the chat box. So please hold your questions until then. There will be also an opportunity for us to kind of talk through some of the data that I'll be sharing, and I'll be sharing links to those reports and all those materials at the end as well. Last thing I want to say is I'm going to be speaking somewhat slowly, but also trying to manage the pace because there is a lot of content. I anticipate we're going to be, at least for this section of the agenda, for 18 to 20 minutes. So I just want to give you all a heads up so that you're monitoring your time and also monitoring your energy during that period as well. But because we have interpreters who are interpreting in other languages, we're going to try to keep up a steady pace, okay? All right, so that being said, let's dive into it. So what you see before you is an image of a horse car and buggy on this right side, a horse car buggy from the mid 1850s. The 1850s was an interesting time during the greater Boston region's development, particularly in Boston, because many of the neighborhoods that we know of today were their own, were their own municipalities, and they were annexed to Boston between the late 1930s to the late 1830s, excuse me, to the late 1880s. So while these cities and towns were starting to become part of Boston's expansion, we also were beginning to get engaged in different innovations in transit. So we're moving from the horse car buggies. By the late 1800s, streetcars began to dominate the way of travel and transportation. And there were a number of private transportation companies that popped up during that time. And actually, the MBTA's origin has a lot to do with the overcrowding of those streetcars in an attempt to consolidate them. So the image you see here is actually part of the construction of what would become Park Street Station, hence why the MBTA is the first subway system in the country. So why is this significant when we talk about Blue Hill Avenue? Because Blue Hill Avenue has always been a major transit corridor to get from one end of the city to another. And at a time, in its early days, it was to get from one town to another in the greater Boston area. In fact, Route 28, as we know, the bus is actually, it's because it's part of Route 28 and a state road, a state operated road that goes through multiple cities and towns throughout, not just through the region, but also connecting North and Southern Massachusetts. Another way to look at it, if you look at this 1902 Bromley map, this is Blue Hill Avenue here. This is Franklin Field, which we can associate now with the Franklin Field projects. And this area here on this end is what would become Franklin Park. Here's another angle to look at it here. So you can see what that looks like. Some of you might not recognize this, but the history of the streetcars that used to run along Blue Hill Avenue, there's a lot of actually historic sites that still speak to that history. So you might not recognize this right now. This is the former Comfort Station, which was Mattapan Station initially during the time of the streetcars. And today, It still stands, and it's actually now a Haitian restaurant. Going back in time, the streetcars were expanded in particular to accommodate the growing amount of immigrant communities, populations that were moving to the southern areas of Boston after those cities and towns became neighborhoods of Boston. We saw a huge influx of Irish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants in particular that were expanding into these neighborhoods. Many of that Irish and Jewish legacy is still present today in some of the churches that we see along Blue Hill Avenue that were synagogues, but are now different denominations of faith-based groups. So if you look at this image here, this is folks waiting to board the then Mattapan streetcar at the intersection of Blue Hill Ave and Arbutus Street. So we're now looking at the early 1930s to the early 1900s to the late 1930s. As these working class immigrant families were moving into the areas, this was also what sparked the development of the triple deckers. It's the iconic 3-story homes that mark much of Mattapan, Dorchester, and Roxbury. There was a reason why this particular style was being created, because at the time it was very easy and quick to make. It was they're largely wood-based developments, and they were big enough to house these large working class families. Because again, this is why the history is important, because these cities and towns like Mattapan was at the time part of Dorchester, and Roxbury were their own towns. They were also mill towns, meaning they were huge places for factories. We still have a lot of zoning that reflects that today, even though those industries have left a long time ago. And so the triple deckers were built specifically centered around the radius, in other words, the mileage, a quarter mile to a mile around Blue Hill Avenue, so that it was easy for those workers to be able to transit to and from their jobs. So much of the way in which the land was being planned and developed was really around trying to increase the workers to get to the factories. At one point, a lot of the greater Boston elite started to actually turn against the idea of the triple deckers, because there was resistance against these opportunities for folks who were working class to now have access to home ownership. And so it was thanks to several political fights, and including putting it on a ballot question, that basically all of the triple deckers, the construction of the triple deckers basically ceased by the end of the 1930s. What's interesting today is that while these institutions have created a lot of ongoing opportunities for different ethnic groups that have come in since the time of white flight, these units tend to be in decline, in decay, because they're so old and they need a lot of upkeep. And still, because of the hot market that is the housing market in the Boston area, some of these triple deckers are upwards of $900,000 to even over $1 million today of their work today. Okay, again, we're talking about the 1930s. There was a lot of things that were happening back then that still affect us today. In particular, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal lending corporation that was established during the time of the New Deal. So this, we're talking about the late 1930s, of federally funded housing development projects. So moving away from the triple deckers, now there was all this investment in building these housing projects. I mentioned Franklin Field in particular, because notably that project was developed and completed by 1954. And this is important to note that this was the same year that Brown versus Board of Education passed. So there was a lot of policies and practices that were really focused on redlining and segregating the communities, separating low-income people of color from middle class and upper class longtime Bostonians. And the intent was to try to identify different neighborhoods. As you can see in this map, the different color coding represents: the green was considered a flourished area. Red is considered an area that needs a lot of work, or where people need to be placed. who are considered lesser class. And so that history of racism is something that we've inherited in the planning field today that we still are dealing with, and it affects how we even look at housing today. The reason why I say this timeline is significant is because while the triple-deckers were being built around access to the streetcars, by the time most of these housing projects, which low-income people of color, like African Americans who were moving into the neighborhoods after being pushed out of Beacon Hill and coming in from the South and many other places, by the time that they were able to move into these neighborhoods, the streetcars were already being replaced by buses. As a matter of fact, the 28 bus route, the bus that replaced the streetcar that ran along Blue Hill Avenue, was one of the last streetcars to be removed and transferred to a bus because there was so much high traffic and high ridership on that route in particular. Here's another image to look at some different angles. If you see here, this is a streetcar coming from Columbia Road. Some of you may recognize this. This is an image from that, right, if you can read here, April 24th, 1949. And here's one coming in from the opposite direction, headed towards Rope Hall. There we go. Here's another angle. Some of you might recognize this. That is the former shelter station at Franklin Park Zoo, which is still there. This here actually was a Jewish synagogue that is now a Baptist church, I believe. Here's another end of Blue Hill Avenue. Recognize this furniture store? I wonder if folks can guess what this is. This is a Type 5 streetcar, by the way. There were different type models of the streetcars. This is now the Family Dollar. This is actually a really interesting image because I took some shots of this area over time. This image is from 2012. This one is from 1955. And if you notice, this brings us to another topic about the changes happening along Blue Hill Avenue, which is that we are seeing a decline in the infrastructure. There's been very little work done. And while there have been a number of studies, there really has not been much done to improve or to upkeep Blue Hill Avenue since those streetcars were removed. And we even see that despite efforts to like plant more trees along the city, where the tree numbers are actually on steady decline along Blue Hill Avenue. Here's an example, another example of that. This is this is the direction heading into Mattapan Square. Notice all the trees that are lined along these arches of the storefront. By this point, the streetcars were about to be removed. The tracks were here, but it was close to being removed. And here's what it looks like today. You can still see those arches, but there aren't any trees. My colleague and I actually did a study while we were doing walks along Blue Hill Avenue earlier this year, and we counted 132 trees from Mattapan Square to Morton Street. And we'll be conducting more counts in the future. And now 132 may sound like a lot, but considering the mileage that makes up Blue Hill Avenue, it's actually not much. Here's another historical tidbit. Some of you may remember the Oriental Theater in Mattapan Square. You can see the top of St. Angela's Church, now Mount Carmel. Here's what Mattapan Square looks like today. There's the top of the church. The Capitol Electric building is now where the theater once stood. But if you take a moment and we look at this image, there's a lot going on in this. There's a lot of chaos in this image alone. A lot of jaywalking. There's a lot of bus congestion. These are the kinds of things that we want to focus on for this project, is how do we reduce a lot of that chaos along the road. So that brings us closer to present day. Now, as I said, there have been a few studies that have been done over the years, but we really hadn't seen much take place or any really projects done that focused on Blue Hill Avenue until we got to more recent dates. Now, I want folks to kind of really think about this because oftentimes we hear that this project is being associated with the 28X, which was a very different project that was terminated, right? And the short of what could be a long history, and I know some of you who are in this meeting actually had been involved in that process in some respect. So basically, back in 2009, there was some American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds available, also known as the Obamulus stimulus funding. The remaining funds that were allocated to Massachusetts at the time, these were like post-recession recovery money, right? There was some leftover money. It was kind of a use it or lose it situation. And so the Patrick administration decided that they were going to take the 28X and transform it, take the 28 bus and transform it into a 28X, converting it essentially to a Silver Line. The 28X was not supported by the community, and largely because there was not strong community engagement in the process. It was kind of like, this is what's going to happen. And people did not support it. And so the project was eventually scrapped after lawmakers who listened to the public put pressure on the state to withdraw the proposal. Because of what happened with the 28X, that led to what is known as the RDM study, the Roxbury Dorchester Mattapan study. This was a study that was led by Mass DOT and MBTA. And there was a community advisory group that was involved with that was a part of this process. There were a number of recommendations that came out of the RDM study, and I will link the report once I'm wrapped up. But some of the issues that were named in the report at the time was that there was a number of issues related to service reliability. There was a need for more improved service planning, a desire to reduce fare box loading time. In other words, when people are getting on the bus and loading their money onto the fare box as they get on the bus. A desire for more technology enhancements. And also one of the core issues that was named was a lack of public trust. Among the recommendations for that report were to create a more streamlined service system, to consolidate some of the bus stops that were too close together, to reduce fare loading times on the buses, to upgrade traffic signals, and add more bus shelters, as well as creating more real-time technology like a time ticketed system so people can know how long it takes before their bus arrives. Some of these things we've actually seen. Like there has been a recent installation of at some of the bus stops of the time ticketed system using solar panels, but most of those changes have yet to happen or in process. So when the 28X process happened, that also was information that fed into Go Boston 2030, the city's first ever citywide transportation planning process that was merged under Imagine Boston 2030. And Imagine Boston 2030 was released in 2017. And in 2018, the first stage of the Blue Hill Avenue Transportation Action Plan began. So that is why there were these proposals for center running bus lanes. Now, I know that's really controversial. And believe me, as someone who lives here as well, it made me nervous as well. But here's the thing about the center running bus lanes. And then I have an update to share. So with center running bus lanes, the reason why that proposal has come up, and I want to stress that it's been a proposal, it has not been set in stone. But the reason why that proposal has come up is because it is the best model to address the number of the issues that have been raised. Things like ridership and mobility access would be streamlined, and that also would free up sidewalks so that there can be more public infrastructure to support sidewalks, like maybe adding some more street furniture or other types of beautification, seating for restaurants, because there are a lot of restaurants that don't have, access to outdoor seating. And it would be improved experience for motorists as well. Some data that we found around this was one, the MBTA 28 bus route is one of the highest utilized bus routes in the system still. It was back when there were streetcars and it is today. That being said, Black bus ridership spends on average 64 hours more per year compared to their fellow white counterparts. according to a state of equity report from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. An INRIC's report found that Boston drivers lose on average 149 hours a year being stuck in traffic. When the RDM study was done, the area median income for Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan was $38,000. That was 28% lower than the city average. To date, there's only been small change in the area median income, and it's about 43,900 for our neighborhoods. This is compared to the area median income for the city of Boston metro region, for which the affordable housing rates are calculated, because the median income of the city is not the only median income that's taken into account when you see like those affordability rates. That number is more than twice that at $98,150. So someone who makes $98,000 has access to affordable housing for someone who is just as someone who makes half that. So it's actually much more competitive housing situation that we're experiencing today. Why am I bringing up housing or environment or trees or lighting when we're talking about the road? Because it's all connected. All these issues are related to each other. And the good news is that the city is raising its awareness about the intersectionality of transit, housing, environment, economic development, and preserving local culture. Because the truth is, we can't talk about transit without talking about housing, without talking about environmental justice, without talking about economic development and small business development, and also talking about how do we preserve the cultural identity of who we are as we make these improvements. So that's why we're looking at other things instead of just looking at center running bus lanes. And I'm going to pass it to Kirsty in a minute. We'll talk a little bit more about the city's commitment about if you all do not support center running bus lanes, then it's not going to happen. I would not be, personally would not be involved with this project if everything was already a done deal, because those don't align with my values. But we need to talk about the conversation expanding beyond just center running bus lanes, because that's become a really polarized topic when there are so many other things we should be exploring when we talk about how to improve the experience or how we live, work, and play along Blue Hill Avenue. Things like lane width. How do we want to adjust? Because currently right now, Blue Hill Avenue is very wide, but how should we change those lanes? Do we want to accommodate bike lanes? Do we want to make sure that there is a dedicated lane for buses so that buses don't get stuck in traffic? Do we want to develop different traffic signaling and traffic calming to help adjust around congestion? Crosswalks. We've got a number of stories that we're hearing from residents who walk, people who are persons with disabilities who are having difficulty getting around just the street. Curb extensions. I mentioned planters and other types of beautification. Should we extend some of the curbs? Also, should we look at even extending the sidewalks to accommodate more sitting furniture or outdoor furniture for eating, other types of creative placemaking? You know, like one thing I would love to be able to do is put like a giant chess game in Mattapan Square, for example, or a dominoes game, you know, to accommodate all of our, you know, Latinx and Haitian brothers and sisters who want to, you know, enjoy some play outside. Let's think about how we can really utilize this process to liven up our neighborhoods while also helping to inform policy to also protect us to stay in place. So when you look at Blue Hill Avenue today, what would you like to change? Sidewalk width, trees, lighting, better bus experience, improve safety conditions for walking? Should we have dedicated bus lanes? Should we even have a median anymore? Should the bus be on the center or stay on the side? Do we want to create things to streamline for less traffic or more traffic? Just remember, there are pros and cons to whatever we choose to do or not choose to do. So thank you all for listening to my presentation. These are some links for more information if you'd like to learn more. I'm also going to pop these links in the chat as well as links to the reports. And once, let me pass it to Kirsty now, and then we'll open it up for a discussion.